Thank you everybody for attending tonight. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person as was originally planned, but as obviously we're under very strange circumstances, but perhaps next year I can come and give you a different talk in person. So thank you very much. Thank you to Chris and Mark really for setting this up. The subject of my talk is of course William Lassell, and can I just mention first of all the correct pronunciation of his surname is Lassell, to rhyme with the word hassle, but I prefer Lassell, so if you forgive me I will refer to his name as William Lassell. I first became interested in him through obviously Alan Chapman, a very well-known Oxford historian who contacted the Society after he came to Liverpool to give what was actually the first William Lassell Memorial Lecture on Tycho Brahe. But he noticed that we had a display at the back of our lecture theatre devoted to William and asked if we could help with his research. And the research culminated in this scientific paper, which was published in the journal Vistas and Astronomy in 1988. However, at the same time, I was actually researching my own family history, but William's became so more interesting and more important that I dropped my own family history and devoted the rest of my time into researching William. As you can see there, Alan Chapman's description of him, a patron and a grand amateur of Victorian astronomy, which I hope to delve into more during this talk. However, I would be drummed out of Liverpool if I didn't mention another famous Liverpudlian astronomer, and that would be, of course, Jeremiah Horrocks, who lived really to a very short age, about 24, but of course was famous for the prediction and successful observation of the transit of Venus in November 1639 old style. He lived in Toxteth Park, which at the time was a township of Liverpool, not part of the city itself. But there is a connection between Jeremiah and William, which I'll go into. Okay, William Lassell. He's not actually a Liverpudlian. He was born in Bolton, Lancashire on June 18th, 1799. His father, Nathaniel, was a timber merchant who at the time was trading successfully and building many of the roofs that went over Bolton factories and other associated premises. William himself was educated in Bolton and later in Rochdale, and the Lassells were Congregationalists. Unfortunately, William's father died in 1810 and the family were forced to move back to Liverpool and were recorded as being there as early as 1815. Now, it's well known on the record that most of William Lassell's descendants were actually very successful clock and watchmakers, and some of them were also the makers of clock and watch making tools, and they all lived within the Toxteth Park area. The most famous of these was the grandfather of the astronomer, also William, which there were so many Williams within this family, and it was obviously a tradition in Victorian times to name your son after a predecessor. So William comes up a lot in his family tree. However, his grandfather, William, who lived between 1736 and 1816, was a very famous and well-known clock and watchmaker. Now, can I just admit that I don't know much about clock and watches, and long case clocks in particular, which was a speciality of the astronomer's grandfather. These two clocks, which you can see, are twin long case clocks, looking very, very similar, and they are twins. The one on the left is Toxteth and the one on the right is called Park. And believe it or not, they are owned by descendants of the astronomer at different parts of the country. The one on the left is owned by descendants who live in Scotland, and the one on the right is owned by them who live in Devon. However, I always try and keep my eye out for similar Lassell clocks, and the one that you can see on the far left was actually discovered in an antique shop when I was in the Isle of Man for a Perseid meteor watch. However, I would have loved to have taken it home and put it in my own living room, but at the time didn't have £6,000 in my pocket, so unfortunately I came back to Liverpool without it. However, I do ask you to keep an eye out for Lassell clocks because they have distinctive dials and lunation dials as well. But again, to admit, I don't subscribe to being a clock and watch expert. Now, of course, surprisingly enough, even though Lassell may have got an interest in studying the night sky from his family members who are clock and watchmakers, and also navigational chronometer makers as well, he actually went into the business of being an apprentice in the brewing trade, probably as early as 1815, when he was still basically a teenager. We do know that a cousin of his was a wine merchant, so he may well have gone into apprenticeship with him. Believe it or not, the wine merchant was also called William. By 1824, Lassell had started his own business as a brewer in Milton Street, Liverpool, and he joined a collection of another 599 brewers who had established themselves in the city at that time. The illustration you can see is basically what a brewery at the time looked like, but it's dated about 1834. Now, before too long, Lassell had made many contacts within the business community of Liverpool, and one of them was Alfred King, who was the primary gas engineer for the Liverpool Gas Company. And together with Alfred's brother Joseph, they were all devotees and lovers of looking at the night sky. And Alfred and Joseph would many times go a few doors down the street to join William Lassell in his back garden to look at the stars and any available planets with a small 3-inch reflecting telescope, which was owned by Lassell at the time. But before long, this friendship between Alfred and Joseph developed in a courtship with their sister, Maria, who he married in 1827. And they had a fairly large family of 4 daughters and 1 son. Believe it or not, the son was also called William. Now, in connection with Lassell's enthusiasm for looking at the night sky and building telescopes, we have to make sure that we connect ourselves with the social and historical aspects of the great maritime port of Liverpool. Now, Liverpool was expanding a great deal, and at one point nearly rivaled London and Bristol as a major port in the UK. But of course, Liverpool dependent on its tidal river, the River Mersey, and it needed many tidal docks. The most famous one, which you may have heard of course, is the Albert Dock, which opened in 1846. But between 1830 and 1860, 17 docks were built, and 5 docks opened in just 1 year, 1848. Most of them were overseen by the great dock engineer, Jesse Hartley, who you can see here pictured. He looks as if he's in a bit of a bad mood, and perhaps one of his contractors have not paid the bills. This is a recent map, but gives you an idea of how many docks Liverpool has up to the present day. Now, just to remind you that the River Mersey was a tidal river, so any ships that tried to unload their goods at the side of the port had the problem of being beached when, of course, the tide went out. So as early as the 1700s, docks were developed which were tidal. Large ships would come into the dock, the gates were closed, the river tide would go out, but of course the ship had the ability to stay afloat, literally, and be unloaded successfully. And of course, when the tide came back in, the gates were opened and the ships were able to go back out with their loaded goods. And of course, once this idea was developed in this particular river, it developed exponentially, and over many, many years from the 1700s, more and more docks were developed. And today we have the container dock, which is probably one of the biggest in not just the UK, but of the world. As well as docks, we have to remember that Liverpool, being a maritime port, had a vast shipbuilding industry as well, most famous being Cunard and Camel Laird, sorry. And of course, it was a starting point really for migrants going to the United States and to Europe. And of course, one of the biggest migratory periods was to do with the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and 1850s. And Liverpool became just the stopping off point for them to going off either to the United States or to different parts of Europe. But of course, many of them stayed in Liverpool to try and find work. And believe it or not, it wasn't the Irish who were the biggest immigrants that came to Liverpool. It was the Scottish who came, and many areas in Liverpool still reflect their Scottish names that developed. The map on the right-hand side is actually from the 1950s, but gives an indication of the developing railway system that Liverpool developed. Of course, goods had to be transported away from the port, and of course it was the railways that had to feed that transport hub. And a lot of goods were coming from the industrial northwest, Bolton, Manchester, and any of the manufacturing hubs that needed goods taken away. And of course, Liverpool was the nearest and closest. And not only are the railways important, of course, there was an expanding canal network as well, which fed Manchester and Leeds. Now, if I may go off the subject of astronomy just for one slide, if I may, and just to describe the brewing industry and history of Liverpool between 1830 and 1840. William Lassell was classed as a common brewer, producing 1,000 barrels of beer a year, selling at different grades, 6, 8 and 10 pence. The Beer Act of 1830 repealed the duty on strong beers and cider, permitting free trade in beer and cider. In just 6 months, nearly 25,000 licenses were taken out in England alone. 800 beer shops opened in Liverpool within 19 days of this new act becoming into force. In 1840, Liverpool had 2,500 brewers, each supplying their own group of beer shops, gin palaces, public houses and brothels, which also sold beer and other things. And at the bottom there's a reference if you want to find out more. But of course, we really need to talk about the astronomy and the astronomical aspects of William Lassell. And by 1830, he'd actually moved to a very substantial residence, which he named Starfield, which became the centre of his universe until the early 1850s. Now, this is an illustration of Starfield House, where he lived for the most part of his time in Liverpool, by the great Victorian artist who resided in Liverpool, W.G. Hardman. This illustration is dated from 1857, but I'll say more about his house but you can see how substantial it was. And remember, by this time, even in the 1830s, he was a fairly rich brewer, so could throw a lot of money at his own residence. These two maps, the one from 1851 at the top, illustrates where he lived. And he lived really right on the outskirts of what was the city boundary. And there is a road called Boundary Lane close by. This is his home of Starfield. And when you do look at this map closely, you can actually see two dark round blobs at the end of what would be his garden. And I'll explain more about those in a minute. But if you look at the history of the area, this lower map is from 1905. The street, more or less where the house used to be, is called Starfield Street. And here is Boundary Lane. So he lived really on the outskirts of Liverpool in the area called West Derby, which is mostly farmland. And as you can see, it was perfectly placed for him to set up an observatory using relatively large telescopes. His first great telescope, which probably coincided with some of the biggest docks being built in Liverpool, was of course his 9-inch, which he set up and had in constant use from about 1833. And he presented the results and how he built the telescope and its associated observatory to the Royal Society in this paper dated April the 7th, 1841. And it is still on record if you wish to read his phenomenal achievement of this. But as I say, it was his first great telescope. Now at the time, if you remember and realise that they weren't using glass mirrors in telescopes, it was speculum mirror, metal mirrors, which could be highly polished. And more about that in a moment. But again, if I refer back to the previous illustration of his house at Starfield, an illustration which was found by my colleague at Liverpool, Darren White, in the archives in the National Portrait Gallery, you can see there in the background of the illustration is what I think is probably a dome, and it may be looking like this, which is a model of Lassell's 9-inch and associated observatory based on the illustration that was in the paper presented to the Royal Astronomical Society. But I've noticed in the past that there is yet another dome situated at the back of this tree in the illustration, which could have remained there as late as 1857. Now, of course, Lassell was beginning to get a bit of a reputation as a very accomplished and well-known astronomer. And before too long, the Liverpool Corporation approached him to join a committee, and they wanted to establish an observatory at Liverpool at Waterloo Dock to be able to commission and clarify and confirm chronometers so to make sure that they worked properly. And it was Lassell, we think, who recommended the first director of this new observatory, John Chapman Hartnett, as the first director. And before too long, after the recommendation and many meetings, which Lassell was joined by a few fellow clockmakers and other established businessmen within Liverpool, the new observatory opened on the Liverpool side of the Mersey in 1844. And as you can see there, it was very well equipped with telescopes, a time ball, and transit instruments as well. And it was Hartnett who actually invented the system where chronometers were placed in different temperature rooms to reflect the different temperatures the ships would experience while they were at sea. So they were properly calibrated before they were put back on ship. But before too long, believe it or not, this observatory fell foul to the expansion of the dock system, and the Waterloo dock, where it was close by, had to be expanded and made bigger. So the observatory was forced to move over to the other side of the river, over to Bidston, and a purpose-built building was put in place and opened in 1866. it was on the site of what was a lighthouse, which was permanently there until about 1840. And in fact, another lighthouse, which you can see just at the top there, at the side on the left-hand side, that was built in 1873 to accompany this new observatory. But again, the history of Bidston will probably take up yet another webinar, so it's maybe the possible subject matter for another talk for you in the future. Now, Lassell was not happy with the 9-inch. He was a bit ambitious, and he had the cash and know-how a little bit to expand and make the 9-inch a bit bigger. So to get a better idea of what to do, he actually visited Ireland and went to see William Parsons, the third Earl of Ross. Now, William Parsons at the time was developing very large telescopes, fairly big for the time they were in use. And of course, the most famous one was the Triton, the 72-inch, 52-foot focus reflector, which was housed and built at Bear Castle. And here you can see an illustration from Robert Ball's book, The Story of the Heavens, dated 1897. But of course, this being such a big metal speculum telescope, it could only be used in a transit method. It couldn't be moved from right ascension to declination like normal telescopes. And actually, it was not so long ago recently refurbished and recommissioned, and it is now a marvellous museum at Bear Castle, and I do recommend you go over there and see it for yourself if you've not been before. However, during the visit, Lassell found that Lord Ross was using wooden-based machines to duplicate the hand movements that were used to polish speculum mirrors. And Lassell thought, I can do better than that, and actually went back to Liverpool with a few ideas and came up with a few machines similar to metal milling machines, but these were steam driven with pulleys and other devices. One of them actually used horses and donkeys going around in a circular motion, a bit like millstones were doing. But he would try to invent a system which could duplicate human hand movements to finally polish the speculum mirrors. And some of them were fairly big, up to 40 to nearly 50 inches in diameter. They would put on certain machines. And he would also do the method of, if he found the mirror wasn't giving the observations he desired, he would simply take the mirrors out of the telescopes, put them back on these machines and repolish them for a bit more. Now, of course, Lassell was becoming a very rich man for the reasons I've already explained: the expansion of the dock system, the population explosion of Liverpool. But he needed a bit of help. And there was two gentlemen who did help him. William Rutherford was regarded as a very fine observer and was nicknamed Eagle Eye by many of his fellow grand amateurs at the time, and would often take away optics that Lassell had done himself to be tested in telescopes, because at the time, for a number of years, William Rutherford lived in Ormskirk, which was basically about an hour's coach drive up the road from where Lassell lived in Starfield. But he didn't really have a competence in engineering, so he hooked up with James Naismith, the famous Scottish engineer, who established an engineering factory in Pentecost in Manchester. He is, of course, famous for inventing the steam hammer, but of course he is noted for his models of the moon to reflect the contours and the mountains, and with, I think it was John Carpenter or James Carpenter, published a book about this time to illustrate these models. And I understand the Science Museum displayed the full lunar disk and map that James Naismith published about this time. So my point is that Lassell had the cash, Dawes had the eye, and Naismith had the engineering know-how, and it was all put into the hands of Lassell to make his 3 very fine telescopes, which I'll say more about now. This is a replica of his 24-inch telescope, again speculum mirror, 20-foot focal length, and we built this to celebrate the discovery of Neptune and the moon Triton in 1996. And we actually put it on the site of Starfield on the playground of St. Michael's School. But again, I want to mention more about that near the end of my talk, if I may. So I will carry on. This is a model based on both the sighting and the mounting of the 9-inch and the 24-inch telescope on a German equatorial mount. Many visitors to the Lassell household at Starfield always noted that the telescope was very easy to use, even by ladies, because even though at the time, if you think about it, when Lassell would have a dinner party, and I believe his dining room table could seat 20 people at one time. In the Victorian age, as you might note, the ladies would recline to a sitting room to play the harpsichord or to do some kind of needlework, and the men would go off with their cigars and talk about the business of the day. Not in the Lassell household. Everyone was invited down to the bottom of the garden to go into the observatory and to use either the 9-inch or, in a few years' time, the 24-inch. We have no known illustrations from the period of the 24-inch. So this is an artist impression made for the period when we were making the Replica Telescope in 1996. But as you can see, it's basically an upgrade of the 9-inch. The 9-inch worked perfectly well. It was tested by Rutherford. It was housed in a perfectly good observatory. So that's basically what he did. Across the garden from the 9-inch, he set up an observatory with this monstrosity of a telescope that he used quite extensively. And on the first night it was used, I think in about 1846-47, he was absolutely overawed by the quality of the optics which he'd polished himself, because in association with the observatories, he had his own workshops and chemistry labs close by. These are some of the remaining and other artifacts that we've been able to save from the 24-inch, because of course it no longer exists. You can see some of the eyepieces that were salvaged, and on the covers in Lassell's own handwriting, the magnifications that some of the eyepieces produced, and he made his own eyepieces as well. Here is a surviving 24-inch telescope, which is still in the Liverpool Museum in Liverpool city centre. It's on loan from the Science Museum in London, who have been asking it to be sent back to London, but it seems to have taken an awful long time because it's still in the museum. And here is the surviving 3-inch finder, which was attached to this 24-inch telescope, which I understand, and it may be an urban myth, but it was actually rescued from a skip by one of the Liverpool Museum curators and brought back to Liverpool to be restored and conserved, and it was on display for a number of years. Now, at the time of Lassell's death in 1880, his 2 daughters, Jane and Caroline, thought that they should really donate the 24-inch. So what I want to do is just to illustrate the type of observatory that was at the bottom of his garden, because this was the Lassell dome, because the Lassell telescope 24-inch and the dome that housed it were donated to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and the 24-inch was actually used for observational work by Greenwich up until about 1896, and this is an illustration of what it looked like. Unfortunately, I think it became a bit old and neglected, so it was broken up for scrap metal, I think, by about the 1900s, and not much of it survives, other than what I've shown you in the museum. Now, Lassell was an absolutely astonishing and detailed observer. Although he wouldn't illustrate much of his work, he would make copious notes. And in the Royal Astronomical Society library, they have, I think, about 4 or 5 boxes of his notebook. Now, just to say that one of the things Lassell was known about was being thrifty. So if you look at his notebooks, they're actually going the wrong way round, because if you turn them the right way and you thumb the pages, you find out that it was a complete record of his brewing business, his tax records, the order of bottles and the payments to his staff, the people who worked at his brewery. But if you turn it the wrong way and use it the wrong way, it becomes an astronomical treasure trove of observations that are used. Being a thrifty person, he was also known to collect the brown paper parceling that came when bottles were delivered to his brewery, tie them up with string and use those as observational books as well. And occasionally, if you do look in the library archives of these notebooks, you can sometimes find penny blacks and penny blues from the Victorian age of stamps that people sent to him, because of course he saved everything. But this particular notebook that you can see in my very hands from June 2010 when I visited, and I would like to mention the handling of these notebooks wouldn't have happened unless it was for Peter Heinley, the librarian of the Royal Astronomical Society at the time, who sadly is no longer with us. But his cooperation was unbelievable, and to handle these notebooks was, well, for me, a great thrill. But this particular page, you can see, is a noted one, because it gives the idea of one of the first observations of Lassell and the planet Neptune, which was first seen in September 1846 and discovered from the Paris Observatory. Now, the story is that Lassell had a sprained ankle, so for a few weeks he couldn't actually go down to the bottom of the garden and use the 24-inch to have a look at this newly discovered planet. And it wasn't until early October 1846 that he got his first good view of the planet, and noticed that not only was the planet elongated, it had an associated 13th magnitude star, which always seemed to accompany the newly discovered planet as well. And of course, this 13th magnitude star turned out to be Neptune's primary satellite, Triton. It was named Triton later on. But of course, another thing that Lassell noticed was that the planet itself was elongated, and he described this as a ring system. And for many years, he got many fellow astronomers up and down the UK with different instrumentation to have a look at Neptune, and they also noted that Neptune was elongated. But Lassell, to give him his due, was never really convinced that Neptune appeared like this in reality. And later on, one of the tests he did was to turn the tube and of course the speculum mirror at the same time, and the distortion that it turned out to be rotated with the mirror cell itself. So it turned out to be that because if an object was high in the zenith, the weight of the speculum mirror would drag down and cause distortion to the image that the observer was seeing at the eyepiece. So he realized that in many ways it wasn't a ring system, it was a distortion of the mirror, and blamed himself for poor engineering. But of course, it was astonishing many, many years later, and you think what Lassell would have thought of this, the Voyager 2 flyby of Neptune and Triton in August 1989, and it took a spacecraft flyby and the Neptune system to be backlit by the sun for a proper ring system to show up. Not as extensive as we know as Saturn, but a ring system nonetheless. And I'm glad to say that the International Astronomical Union and NASA have since then agreed to name one of the rings Lassell in his honor. And also these beautiful images that were sent back by Voyager 2 of Neptune's moon Triton, with its nitrogen ice geysers that you can see here. There's two of them on this image, and it's different cartography and different formations caused by the solidification of ice, because it's so far in the cold region of the solar system. But again, that's probably the subject of yet another hour's webinar, so I'll move on. Lassell was in constant competition with one particular observer, and that was William Crouch Bond, who was the chief observer at Harvard Observatory in Boston, Massachusetts. And he co-discovered Saturn's moon Hyperion in 1848, because of course Bond had 15 degrees more sky than Lassell, so it was always one step ahead of Lassell in his discoveries. And it was a constant bugbear, I think, with Lassell, that this William Crouch Bond was getting there just a few hours before him. However, many of their discoveries were co-discoveries, so I'm glad to say they did share things in the end. We come to the 1850s, and by no means Lassell would be, in this day and age, a superstar. He was well known within the astronomical community, both scientifically and socially. And before too long, he got into the ear of a certain couple. Prince Albert and Her Majesty the Queen, Queen Victoria, were visiting Lancashire in October 1851, and they stayed in Croxteth Park, which is the home at the time of the Earl of Sefton. And on their way to the tour of most of the northern part of Lancashire, Manchester and associated places, they stayed in Croxteth Hall. And on the night of their first stay, they invited dignitaries within the area to come and say, well, basically hello, and have an audience. Now again, this may be an urban myth, and I've not personally been able to find any evidence of this. But the story is, as you know, that Prince Albert was very much interested in the industrial engineering and scientific know-how of the time, and of course went on to develop the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, which exhibited many different aspects of British life, both social and scientific. But when Lassell was invited to Croxteth Hall to this audience, apparently he was introduced at the door, but as soon as he came into the room, apparently the royal couple rose to greet him and not the other way around, which I believe was unheard of at the time. So my point is, it gave you an illustration of how well received Lassell was at that day and age. Now, he began to realize that the expansion of Liverpool was not doing any good for the environment or the atmosphere even then, not just because of the weather, which we still have to comprehend with today in the UK, but also the industrial expansion of Liverpool, both from commercial and factory chimneys, but also domestic chimneys as well. And it's famously noted that William Rutherford advised Lassell to rename Starfield Cloudfield because of the problems he was having. But he got a bit fed up with living in Starfield, and in the end, in the early 1850s, he moved to this dwelling, Bradstones, which was in the township of West Derby. This illustration unfortunately shows you it being demolished in 1972 to make way for a housing project. But I just want to illustrate to you that you can still see some of the workshop buildings that Lassell had set up behind his very large house, which I believe had 12 bedrooms and 2 dining rooms. And he had a servant number which approached at one stage to 15. But it was at Bradstones where he built and tested his third and last great telescope, the 48-inch, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is a map of the Sandfield Park area where Bradstones was, his mansion that he himself had built. And he was surrounded by fellow businessmen who were just as wealthy as he was, shipbuilders, tobacco merchants, cotton traders. They all lived in very big, lavish mansions. But Lassell would use their chimneys to test his optics, and sometimes chimneys that were seen on the Wirral, especially when he was testing his great telescopes. Now, this slide is to illustrate a bit of advice if you ever do dabble into looking into the history of astronomy. And my advice is do not ever give up. Lassell has been an interest of mine for nearly 30 years now, and I've not really gave up the enthusiasm to look for more information about him. Now, this is a Victorian daguerreotype of his son, William, who predeceased him in 1875. But of course, when Lassell, retired to take up a bit more of astronomy, it was his son who took over the brewery, made it a lot bigger and established a new brewery in North Wales. But I was intrigued to see that he died in Scotland, just outside Edinburgh, as I say, in 1875, through very much ill health. And this newspaper article, which you can see, is from a Scottish newspaper, which indicates a court case, because unfortunately he was inflicted by a mental illness caused by the social disease of syphilis, which was very common in the Victorian age. And this court case was to see if his son was compos mentis in looking after both his business and his family requirements and commitments. And the court case heard that in his paralysis to do with his mental illness, he was referring to himself as the Holy Ghost, and convinced himself that he was actually married to the Queen, and called himself the Duke of Hamilton. But I have to say that this may have been kept a bit quiet, because during this time when this court case was going on, William Lassell, the astronomer, his father, was the president of the Royal Astronomical Society, so it may have been hushed up. But this is a newspaper article I found quite by accident when, as you know, a lot of newspapers are now digitized, and if you put Lassell in the research engine of the digital library, you can end up with finding some gems of history. And it's just a point I wanted to make. If you do dabbling into anyone's astronomical history, do not at any stage give up. Lassell became completely disillusioned with the British weather and moved the telescope, the 24-inch, and everything else, and I mean everything else, his household, his workshops, his staff, and sailed to the British colony at the time of Malta, and stayed there between 1851 to 53 with the job of doing observations using the 24-inch. And I do mean he took everything with him. Alan Chapman has described it as one of us in today's day and age, financing and setting up our own observational complex on the Hawaiian Islands, or at the Chilean mountains, or on the Canary Islands. It's that such a big feat of achievement that he did. And this sailing ship is the Cunard steamer, the SS Damascus, which is what was used to make this first trip in 1851. And the manifest describes the Lassell household going on the ship sailing from Marseille to Malta with 260 packing cases. As I say, the household, the servants, and a grand piano was listed as well. Malta, of course, was a staging point for the Crimean War, so it was very well defended and its ports were very well served. So it's probably an ideal place for Lassell to go to, just for a certain period of time. And we do note that from his notebooks, he was having as much as 300 clear nights out of a calendar year, with hardly any deprivation in weather. So an ideal place for him to take a very large astronomical telescope. But in later years, he took his larger telescope, his great 48-inch, this marvel of ingenuity, typical for the Victorian age, a telescope of 48-inch diameter speculum mirror, a skeleton tube which could cope with the heat exchanges through the tube so that the mirror could cool down quicker and not interfere with its observations, an observation tower which had a lift so that if anything was high up in the zenith, the observer could easily reach the eyepiece, and it didn't have any kind of dome or covering because, of course, the weather in Malta was generally very, very good. And it rested on a platform which could be moved by just one Maltese navvy, as he called it, using a piano metronome and pulling a lever so that the platform and the whole telescope would move to cancel out the Earth's rotation, so that the observer could keep the object of interest in the eyepiece for so long. Now, it's unclear exactly where the 24-inch and the 48-inch were sighted, but we think it was on the Aegean Peninsula by the Valletta Bay, which you can see here on a modern holiday photograph of mine. But as you can see, the area is now being heavily encroached by modern day holiday apartments and hotels. But we think the telescopes were placed at this promontory here in the open air. Now, again, to illustrate the ingenuity that he did using the telescopes, this was a Lassell mirror B, which is discovered in the Liverpool History of Science, I think in about 1974. Because of the shape of the container, it was thought to be a lady's hat box and was ignored for many years by curator staff at the museum until someone opened it. And they found that it had a speculum mirror with a note inside in Lassell's own handwriting, which illustrated that it was last published on July the 9th, 1875. So it gives you an idea of the fact that he was able to take these mirrors out of the telescopes if he wasn't happy, polish it for a short time, have it washed, corrected, whatever it required, and then placed back into the observatories. And of course, he had them labelled A, B, C, and D. We're up to finding this mirror. Well, it was a hat box which turned out to be a Lassell mirror. Again, if you happen to be looking after a museum storage area and there's a box that's not been opened for many years, I would have a look inside if I were you. You never know what you find. When Lassell was established in Malta, for the first visit anyway, he actually employed an assistant, a German astronomer called Albert Marth, but he was regarded and described at the time as a calculator. But he was basically an assistant. He would assist the prime observer in using the telescope, recording any observations, and making sure that correspondence was taken care of and things like that. However, in relation to what was happening back in Starfields, if you remember, even in Malta, the Lassells were being inundated by visitors all the time, and they would still have very large dinner parties. So on one occasion, Lassell said to Albert, "I don't need to use the 24-inch tonight, it's all yours." So you can imagine someone running down to wherever the observatory was and taking up the offer without any hesitation at all, while the astronomer William Lassell looked after his dinner guests with his wife. Now, it turns out that Albert was more interested in deep sky objects as opposed to William Lassell, who was really a distant solar system planet observer. The gaseous planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and of course later Neptune. And Albert recorded and mapped about 600 nebulae over quite a number of nights of observations when he was allowed to use the observatory. But of course, when it came to the scientific paper to be published, it was Lassell's name that went first and not Albert. But I don't think they had too many disagreements about that. But again, Albert Marth, who is his assistant for many years at Malta. These are just an indication of the detail that Lassell was recording with the 24-inch. As I indicated, he was more a note taker than an artist, but when he could, he would actually do some illustrations. And his two daughters, Jane and Caroline, would also help him with observations. If their father couldn't see any detail, he would probably ask them to get into the lift and go to the eyepiece to see Saturn. But I do know that Saturn was his favourite object. Of course, it is for everybody, I think. Really, when the rings are full on like this, it's a beautiful sight, really, in any telescope. And of course, even though Lassell would take copious notes about what he saw, he may well have asked his two daughters to do illustrations for him based on what he saw himself. But we really know that basically he would try and do his own observations if he could, recording the detail on the ring system and of course the cloud belts on Saturn itself. Now, after the last trip to Malta in the 1860s, 61 to 63, I think, he came back in 1864. He didn't go back to Liverpool. At that stage, his son was well enough to take over the running of the brewery, and Lassell moved down south to where it was a bit clearer sky-wise, and moved into what was then the first residence he never had purposely built for him, which was this Ray Lodge in Maidenhead. And as you can see, the people of Maidenhead have named the street or area, the road where it is now, Lassell Gardens. When I was there in 1993, it was actually being converted into something. And we made investigations about what it was, because some of the rooms were being made bigger. And if you remember, Lassell was in the brewing business. He had connections with the wine industry as well. But believe it or not, when I was there in 1993, Ray Lodge was being converted into a Betty Ford clinic for alcoholics. And so he was in his retirement years now. He didn't really have the brewery to worry about. He'd gone into semi-retirement really, even with astronomy. But between 1870 and 72, he became president of the Royal Astronomical Society. And these, we think, are three of the known portraits that were done at the time. We think that the one on the right-hand side was the official presidential portrait that was published. And you've probably seen quite a number of versions of those. Although this one, which probably gives an illustration of someone who spends many, many nights at the observatory and telescope with those bags under his eyes, is probably one of the ones that was rejected. This standing one is actually housed in Bolton Local History Library, but there are a number of these which you can find, both head and shoulder type ones. But these are all of the same sitting, because I've had an expert into Victorian clothing check his jacket and his bow tie, and it's probably about the same time these photographs were taken. He never really lost the interest in astronomy. Even in Maidenhead, he set up the 24-inch, and he was doing observations of Jupiter up until close to his death, and also doing parallax experiments as well with different stars. But he tried to get a new home for the 48-inch, which did come back from Malta. And the story is he tried to sell it to the Melbourne Observatory in Australia, but they wouldn't accept it, and they actually had another one built by Grub Parsons of Ireland, which was set up in the 1880s, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And unfortunately, there is a letter that was published in the journal The Observatory, which illustrates that Lassell dismantled the 48-inch and had workmen smashing up the mirrors and the remaining of the telescope, and it was sold for scrap, because he had a bit of a, Lassell that is, had a bit of a run-in with the selling of railway shares at the time. And of course he had to change his own will because his son predeceased him in 1875. Now, as part of the project to build the Replica Telescope in 1996, which I referred to earlier, I was able to contact some of the living relatives of Lassell who were still alive. And one of them was Elizabeth Blackster, who was his great several times his niece. And she had a few bits of memorabilia from the cells that she still had. And one of them was this beautiful brooch, which I think was may have been a birthday gift from wife to husband, from Maria to William. And if you open it up, it has a nice presidential portrait of Lassell, plus a lock of his hair. And when I showed this photograph to Alan Chapman, he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could perhaps use the DNA contained in the hair and clone many hundreds of Lassells and have them running around the country building telescopes. It's a lovely idea, and I hope one day when we get back to normality it could actually turn out to be true. Lassel's health finally failed, and he died in October 1880 through heart failure and was laid to rest in St. Luke's Churchyard, Maidenhead. And this is the gravestone I visited again in 1993. But it's sad for me to reflect that my own society, Liverpool, was formed just 1 year later in October 1881 and established itself as one of the biggest astronomical organisations for the first 10 years of its life, between 1881 and 1890, and is actually, as you probably may well be aware, the parent society to the British Astronomical Association. And if he'd lived a little bit longer, I'm sure Lassell would have been our honorary president or patron, and been very much welcome to our meetings. Sadly, it wasn't to be. A couple of years ago, I made contact with Maidenhead Astronomical Society because, as you can see, Mother Nature had taken over the gravestone of Lassell, and I asked if they wouldn't mind doing some restoration work, and they kindly spent many a day in St. Luke's Churchyard, and they finally renovated it and got it to what you can see in these images. And in St. Luke's Churchyard in Maidenhead, you can see Lassel's last resting place. And of course, sadly, he was joined by Marie, his wife, just 2 years later, and this is where he has been laid to rest. So as I come and bring this lecture to an end, my first webinar in history, I just want to go over a few of Lassel's discoveries. He discovered the sixth star, the Trapezium, in M42, the Great Nebula in Orion, and that was 1842. Neptune's chief moon, Triton, 1846, which I've talked about this evening. Also Saturn's eighth satellite, Hyperion, in 1848, jointly with its great rival Bond. Saturn's crepe ring in 1850, which they jointly discovered both with Dawes and Bond. The two faint moons of Uranus, Ariel and Umbriel, in 1851. And of course, with the help of Albert Marth, catalogued 600 nebulae and a few star clusters, publishing the results in 1866. And of course, as I've sort of, well, dabbled in really, not giving you too much detail because of the time involved, he designed and constructed a very large speculum mirror equatorial telescopes, which arguably were the Hubble Space Telescopes of their day. And unfortunately, well, miraculously, you could easily use these telescopes on your own without any assistance from anybody. Just a quick word about the replica, which we built for the 150th anniversary of Neptune's discovery and that of Triton. And we actually cited it for the celebrations, the actual anniversary of when Lassell confirmed that he discovered Triton, which was October the 2nd. We cited it on St. Michael's Playground, which was where Starfield would have been, in the approximate place where the observatory was. Now, since the 150th anniversary, this replica telescope did go on public display, but unfortunately, the museum needed the space for renovation work and other exhibits. So the replica, since about the year 2000, has been in storage. But next year is the 175th anniversary of Neptune's discovery and that of Triton. So we were hoping to have the replica telescope on public display again in the very massive entrance to the museum, which was part of the renovation work I mentioned. However, the pandemic has probably put those plans into touch. But we're still seeing if we can do something perhaps in later years to honour Lassell and his connections with Liverpool. So, as they say, watch this space. But finally, can I link astronomy and the brewing industry for you? This is the Observatory Pub, which was down the road from Bidston Observatory on the Wirral. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. But can you imagine the staff and the directors of the observatory saying to their wives, "I'm just going to the observatory, my love. I'll be back shortly." And possibly lastly, this is possibly my last slide, I think. This is an illustration from a copy of the 1927 Liverpool Echo, which was published on the day of the total solar eclipse, the 32nd total solar eclipse that was successfully observed from Giggleswick in northern England. But unfortunately in Liverpool, with the 32nd totality, it was clouded out. But as you can see from these adverts and the pub I've just showed you, that astronomy, telescopes, planets and drinking beer still go on in Liverpool today. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Gerard. Mark, would you like to do the honours?
Yeah, Gerald, that was absolutely fabulous to hear the history of such a famous astronomer. I think we should all kind of do our usual thanks by giving our applause for the wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant.
Excellent. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I'm sure we might have some questions, but I just wanted to say it's particularly interesting for me, Gerard, being a fellow Scouser, and it's not often I see an astronomical talk where my house is on the map, or at least pretty much. On that photograph of the old map of Liverpool, the bottom end there between St Michael's and Otterspool is Egbert, Sefton Park, which you know well. Means nothing to anybody else, but somewhere on there was me. But absolutely fascinating. And the other thing that I take from it is, if Liverpool still had 800 pubs and God knows how many breweries today, I don't think I'd ever have left, actually. But no, absolutely wonderful, beautifully illustrated, some fantastic pictures there as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
And I had no idea that that summary at the end, M42, the trapezium stars, and I knew about Triton, but some other stuff. What a great guy.
Yeah, there's a few star clusters. They're fairly widespread star clusters, but a few of them are that were first seen by Lassell when he was in his trips in Malta. I can't remember a lot of them offhand where they are, but they are those sort of those, when you